There are few phrases that annoy me quite as much as all relationships are transactional. This seemingly simple idea underwrites so many of our complaints about love and about one another. And yet, I think the arguments for it are remarkably weak. I was reminded of this when watching Louis Theroux's documentary on the manosphere, and amidst everything else, I noticed that almost every person he spoke to behaved as if the transactionality of relationships was just a sacred truth beyond question. Because on the internet, cynicism is almost always the order of the day. There is an overwhelming tendency to spit on optimism or hope and claim that everything is awful and everyone is terrible. But this is a mistake, and here's why. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. 1. The Presumption of Transaction. Okay, let's get the critique of this particular phrase out of the way before I look at its wider implications. Essentially, I think this phrase is what's called a deipity. This is a term coined by the philosopher Daniel Dennett that's used to describe a vague statement that has two interpretations, one of which is true but trivial, and another that is radical but false. So, everything happens for a reason is a classic deipity. It either expresses the mere idea that everything's been brought about by some kind of process, which is true, but it's also quite obvious, or it means that the world is following some kind of ultimate higher rationality, which, unless you're a theist or a stoic, is radical but false. A deipity can be really quite rhetorically powerful because you can argue for the trivial version and then just sort of act like you've proven the radical version. You sometimes see this in manifestation circles, for example. Someone will argue for the weaker claim that our thoughts influence what we do and what we do affects reality, to the incredibly radical idea that our thoughts control reality directly, which is not true in any non-trivial sense. A deipity is, in effect, a ready-made Motte and Bailey. I put it to you that all relationships are transactional is a deipity, and later in the video we'll see that it's part of a kind of family of deipities with pernicious implications for our relationships to one another. So let's just take the phrase, all relationships are transactional. At one level, this might not only be true, but actively desirable. What would be the alternative of a transactional relationship? Would it be a totally one-sided relationship where one person gets absolutely nothing out of the pairing and the other one just parasitically takes? Well, this is hardly the model of interpersonal companionship that we want to promote. You certainly wouldn't stay with someone if being with them genuinely added nothing to your life, or at least I hope you wouldn't outside of some exceptional circumstances. Would the other person even properly love you if they wanted you to stay in that situation? So it does seem like there is some truth to the notion that all relationships are, in this sense, transactional. But the trouble is, the statement is often used to equivocate between two really different meanings of the word transactional, one of which is probably true, or mostly true, and the other of which is probably false, but is also radically cynical. Often the more plausible version that I've just given is argued for only for people to act as if the more radical cynical version has been demonstrated. The two interpretations of the statement, as far as I can see, are roughly as follows. The broad interpretation of all relationships are transactional holds that relationships are transactional in the kind of wide sense that everyone should, over the long term, get something out of the relationship. Moreover, long-term, serious imbalances in what someone gets out of the relationship will likely lead to the deterioration of the relationship overall. On the other hand, the narrow interpretation of all relationships are transactional holds that relationships are tit for tat. If someone isn't getting exactly as much as you are out of a relationship, they will leave you in the immediate future. Moreover, one person's gain comes at a cost to the other person in this narrow interpretation. The difference between these two positions is really quite large, and it's also largely one of time horizon. The broad version is a long-term prediction. It can accommodate pretty large periods of imbalance so long as it doesn't reach a breaking point. The narrow version, on the other hand, is a very short-term idea. It suggests that even temporary imbalances in what one person is getting out of the relationship will set up a disaster. It also implies an adversarial or zero-sum relationship between the pair. It assumes that if someone is getting something out of the relationship, that is coming at a cost to the other person. The broad version just doesn't imply this at all. And the broad interpretation strikes me, for what it's worth, as relatively plausible for the reasons that I've already given. But people often move from the broad to the narrow interpretation without noticing the immense differences between these two ideas. The broad version should, in my view, basically invite no cynicism. It just amounts to saying that people want to feel fulfilled in their relationships, and if they are behaving reasonably, that is part of what they will pursue in their decision-making around the relationship. But the narrow version paints us all as really quite myopically egoistic agents, looking to suck our romantic partners dry for all they have. Now, I've had a few romantic relationships, and while they've had their ups and downs, I can't say that this tracks my experience at all, though perhaps I've been extraordinarily lucky. As we just saw, much of the difference between the two versions is scalar. The agents in the broad version are still deeply interested in what they can get out of a relationship, but the level of flexibility is much higher, and there's no assumption that happiness is zero-sum. This allows for you to be happy for your partner. Since the difference is, for the most part, in degree rather than kind, it can seem appropriate to use the same word transactional for both. But I think this is a really quite misleading mistake, because the difference between the broad and narrow interpretation has profound behavioral consequences. If the broad version is true, we shouldn't panic. I think that actually it doesn't have any kind of detrimental effects on our view of love or humanity. But if the narrow version is true, then I'd forgive you for swearing off romance entirely. It's quite a depressing way to think. Think about it this way. If the transactional nature of the relationship is evaluated over a very long period of time, let's say 5 years, then that's a really quite robust connection. It would take 5 years of not getting enough out of the relationship for it to collapse. But if all relationships only worked on the very short time horizon implied by the narrow interpretation, say a week or a month, then it would totally rob us of the ability to be confident that any of our relationships can weather hard times. If I may digress slightly, I imagine that part of the potential benefits of, say, being married is that splitting up is a total ball ache, and this naturally extends the time horizon of an evaluation. It means that things have to get really bad for quite a while before it is worth getting a divorce over it. Additionally, the idea in the narrow version that relationship satisfaction is necessarily a zero-sum game just seems false. It's cynical, but it's untrue. It ignores the fact that people can enjoy doing things for their romantic partner, especially if those things are appreciated. And I don't think that that's even that unusual. It seems like a very common everyday experience. Even outside of romance, I'm sure most of us have bought a gift for someone and taken pleasure in someone else receiving and enjoying the gift. And that's not to speak of all the things that couples will enjoy doing together. If a couple goes out for a walk or has a nice conversation or sleeps together, this is something that they both enjoy and doesn't cost the other anything in emotional or monetary terms. I feel like this is so obvious that it almost seems strange to say it out loud, but two people can enjoy something together without that enjoyment coming at the cost of one another. The amount of pleasure in a relationship is not some fixed quantity that has to be fought over, as the narrow version implies. So, once we extend the time horizon and remove the idea that relationship satisfaction is a zero-sum game, then we can truly say that all relationships are transactional. But it's no longer that depressing. We're just back to the broad interpretation. On reflection, we would kind of want most relationships to be transactional in this wide way, and probably most romantic relationships especially so. The alternative would be to say we should forge romantic relationships regardless of whether or not they make us totally miserable. And I think that would just require serious argumentation to support. There are a few exceptional circumstances I can possibly think of, but by and large, the idea of broad transactionality in this sense seems perfectly fine and not at all depressing. But this channel is all about honing your analytic skills. And if you want to do just that, then I highly recommend that you check out today's sponsor, Brilliant. We all know that studying STEM subjects like maths or science or programming can be difficult and unintuitive, but Brilliant has interactive lessons and personalized practices so that you can learn these subjects by completing activities rather than just staring at a screen or watching a video. Brilliant has added a huge number of topics this year, so you can learn anything from programming with functions to probability theory to learning the ins and outs of how large language models work or classical mechanics. Their courses are crafted by high-quality teachers, including ones from top institutions like MIT and Harvard. If you want to improve your own critical thinking skills, then you should check out the logic courses that Brilliant has to offer, which will let you see what logic is all about. And with even a little bit of logic, the world can become a whole lot clearer. Additionally, a friend of mine wanted to recommend Brilliant's calculus games, as he said they are really fun and he's really enjoyed them. To learn for free on Brilliant for a full 30 days, go to brilliant.org/unsolicited advice or scan the QR code on screen, or just click the link in the description. Brilliant's also giving my viewers 20% off an annual premium subscription, which gets you unlimited daily access to everything on Brilliant, so please do check that out. But anyway, back to the video. When people are arguing for the transactionality of relationships, they will often argue for the broad version that is relatively unobjectionable, pretty easy to demonstrate in some form, and relatively trivial. But they will then use that point to infer all sorts of cynical conclusions about romance. They've implicitly swapped from the broad version to the narrow version of this phrase. I notice this a lot in the so-called manosphere, as well as similar relationships content that's aimed at young women that's been shown to me by some of my friends. In both cases, the idea that all relationships are transactional was implicitly used to support a relationship ethic of, at best, kind of rough egoism, and at worst, outright, almost malicious exploitation. So, although this is quite an everyday logical mistake, it's just equivocating on the meaning of a term, it has really quite disastrous consequences for how we then approach our relationships. Because if we are locked into the narrow interpretation, then it gives us the expectation that romantic partners are always out to get us. And maybe in some situations this is true, but it's certainly not a helpful attitude for forging long-term bonds with other people. Now, I wrote something about this phrase on my Substack months ago to kind of, purge my frustration. And in fact, this first section was adapted from that post. But I've been unable to stop thinking more broadly about this topic, because what holds for phrases like all relationships are transactional also holds for a variety of ideas that I think inculcate an unduly cynical view of the world in listeners. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about that now. 2. Egoism and the self-fulfilling prophecy. How often have you heard someone argue that all people are fundamentally selfish? I made a video on this topic quite a long time ago now, actually, and that video went into the philosophical variants of this position. But I want to revisit the idea here, because specifically in public discourse, I have a similar attitude towards this idea as I do towards all relationships are transactional. When I hear someone argue for this position, it normally goes something like this. When you act, you are, at some level, only acting because you are trying to get internal emotional fulfillment out of the action. Even when you're trying to do the right thing and behave selflessly, you must be getting some kind of internal reward for that behavior, or else you simply wouldn't be doing it. Either you're trying to assuage your conscience, or you genuinely take joy in doing good things, but either way, your motives are egoistic. In a very wide sense, I think this argument does hold. However, similar to the last section, once we adopt that wide sense, the argument also becomes basically trivial. If you expand the category of egoistic motives to include any and all emotional states, and then basically define emotional states as those internal states which motivate you, then you have proven that all people are egoistic just by moving definitions around like pieces on a chessboard. This is obviously not what we normally mean when we talk about someone being selfish or egoistic. Take the following description of a paradigmatically selfless person. This is John. Whenever John sees someone in pain, he feels so strongly that something must be done that he stops and helps them immediately. When he won the lottery, he had such compassion for those who had less than he did that he gave all the money away to charity. This person, under the above argument, would be egoistic. So whatever definition of egoism being used here trivially covers all or almost all possible human behaviors. To riff on a thought by Bishop Butler, surely this form of egoism has things slightly backwards. We praise the selfless person because of how strongly they feel for other people, not because they don't feel anything for others and somehow supernaturally act selfless anyway. Historically, taking joy in doing good things has often itself been considered a virtue. For Aristotle, the hallmark of the highly virtuous person is that they not only behave virtuously, but they do this in a joyful and effortless way. There's nothing in this trivial egoism that should make us despair of humanity in any way, shape, or form. But nonetheless, I often see people arguing for this trivial version of everyone is selfish, but then acting like this is a depressing truth about the world and implying that it should fundamentally shift how we see other people and ourselves. But this is pretty much the same kind of equivocation that we saw in the phrase all relationships are transactional. They've switched the meaning of the word selfish from the very broad version used in their argument to a narrower version that merely encompasses material self-interest, that is, only desiring your own benefit and never feeling compassion or fellow feeling or sympathy for other people. But we all know that that version of egoism plainly is false. We know that people do feel compassion and sympathy and are capable of being motivated by the suffering of others. That is empirically demonstrated each and every day. So, again, a trivial but true idea is swapped out for a radical and false idea with incredibly cynical implications at the last moment. There are more sophisticated versions of egoism in the academic literature that do attempt to thread this needle, but I've never seen them make their way into public discourse, and this is a video largely about public discourse, so I'll just set them aside for now. The trouble with both of the cynical mantras we've looked at so far is that although it is just, a simple equivocation fallacy, it really isn't anything special, they do impact how we perceive one another if we buy into them. An article by Dale T. Miller observes that people actually often do view one another as narrowly egoistic. To quote him directly, that the average person is a self-interest theorist, someone who believes we're motivated primarily by narrow self-interest, and one in the neoclassical mode at that, is well documented in general surveys as well as in more systematic studies. This is not to say that the average person totally disbelieves in selflessness, but at the very least, a belief in the widespread motivating power of narrow self-interest above most other factors has bled into our view of one another. We assume that narrow self-interest has a larger role, an outsized role in our motivation, whereas, in fact, it is simply one amongst many other motivating factors. And if you want to look at some more analysis of situations where I think this idea is helpful versus unhelpful and evidence versus unevidence, then you can check out my larger video on this idea right here that goes into a bit more of the general philosophical literature around the topic. In many ways, the idea that everyone is selfish sort of just is the same idea behind all relationships are transactional, but on a larger scale. If anything, I suspect that it's partly our underlying presumption that people are narrowly egoistic that causes these more domain-specific proclamations of selfishness. But in each case, it does involve flattening people's actual behavior and motivations in a major act of equivocation, and I think that's an error. But of course, the trouble in both the relationships case and the wider selfishness case is that they can become self-fulfilling prophecies. If you believe that everyone is out for themselves, then it only makes sense for you to follow suit. That is the reliable way to avoid becoming a sucker. We thus end up in a situation where the belief that all relationships are transactional and that everyone is selfish can actually beget narrowly egoistic behavior. Let's take the relationships example. I've seen sentiments from both sides of the sexual aisle online argue that relationships are fundamentally a matter of extracting as much as you can from the other person and them attempting to do the same to you, and the creator tends to present this as some kind of hidden truth that you, the viewer, can use to adjust your own behavior within your romantic pairings. And the solution these creators tend to offer is pretty simple, but also quite worrying. They think that you should try to do your best to extract much more from your lovers before they do the same thing to you. And within the framework they've introduced, this makes total sense, because under the presumption that all relationships are already transactional and extractive, and that there's no alternative to this mode of being, well, why wouldn't you try to get all you can out of the situation? I mean, that's what the other person is doing, and if nothing else, it's the only way to adopt a responsible defensive posture in an inherently combative situation. But this is a really quite concerning shift, because the more people who believe that all relationships are fundamentally transactional, or that all people are selfish in this narrowly defined way, the more rational it becomes to genuinely behave in a transactional and narrowly selfish way towards others. While these ideas can start off as false, they have the potential to become more predictive simply by convincing more people that they're already true, and people changing their behavior as a result. Now, importantly, I'm not trying to fearmonger here. I'm not saying that a majority of people out there think that everyone is fundamentally egoistic in this narrow sense and have adjusted their own behavior as a result. What I am saying is that I've met people, and offline people, not just people on the internet, who are convinced of this deeply cynical vision of reality. And I don't know if they've adjusted their behavior as a result, but what I will say is that it would be rational for them to do so. And it is worth noting that the people selling this cynical message often do have something to gain from it. Most of the bigger content creators I found offering this cynical relationship advice had some kind of product accompanying it. For a lot of the more manosphere-y guys, it was some kind of dating coach thing or investment advice, with the marketing often being around how many women's successful investments would get you. And on the other side, it was often also paid dating advice specifically based around getting a rich partner or extracting as much as you can from your current partner. But can't we see the conflict of interest here? A fear is created in the viewer, and then the solution is sold in the form of courses and apps and paid advice that is meant to insulate you from that fear, to turn you from the hapless prey of these egoists to an egoistic predator yourself. The whole economy of this plan doesn't work unless, first, a kind of general cynicism can be implanted in the viewer. I don't think many people start out wanting to extract instead of wanting to love. But once you've convinced people that everyone else already has the extractive approach and that you're the fool getting left behind, then it just makes sense, given that this is supposedly the only game available, that you would want to master it. The cynicism is the whole linchpin and philosophical foundation of the sales pitch. Ironically, this is the very thing that leads people into the hands of those genuinely looking to take advantage of them. And let's talk about cynicism more generally, because I think that it is a very complex property, for lack of a better term. And I think we really need to get a handle on where it works and where it can lead us astray. 3. The seduction of cynicism. On the face of it, cynicism is quite a depressing worldview. It doesn't seem pleasant to walk around utterly convinced that everyone around you is pursuing narrow self-interest. And yet, people do find it appealing, and I don't think they're being ridiculous or totally irrational in this. I see cynicism overall as a kind of beautiful mirage. In the short term, it seems exciting, and it promises to protect you from the evils of the world. But in the long term, it undermines the very things that would make you fulfilled. And that's kind of what we're going to explore in the next couple of sections. But first, let's have a little terminological housekeeping, if that makes sense. Cynicism, of course, originally referred to an ancient philosophical school whose most famous member is Diogenes of Sinope, who was known for practicing extreme asceticism and preaching that we should live close to and in accordance with nature, which for him entailed a variety of really quite drastic practices, including eschewing property or a house and acerbically criticizing those around him for blindly following established social mores. He was skeptical of almost all of the social norms prevalent in Athens and Corinth at the time, and considered them to be unnatural constraints foisted upon natural man. And he essentially existed in a kind of living example of rebellion against these norms. I want you to put a pin in Diogenes because we'll be coming back to him in a bit more detail in the next section. But over 2 millennia later, cynicism means something slightly different. I've been referring to the two ideas that all people are selfish and that all relationships are short-term transactional as cynical ideas. And I imagine that hasn't struck you as particularly strange in its usage. But modern cynicism isn't like a philosophical school where we can break things down into a relatively clear set of beliefs and practices, even if they vary between cynics. We'll instead have to abstract from the general set of things that we call cynical to a wider definition. Here's how the philosopher Samantha Weiss does just that in her paper Cynicism and Morality. Cynicism is 1, a stance of disengagement, and 2, of distrust, contempt, and or skepticism to differing degrees adopted towards humans, their institutions, and values, and 3, adopted as a response to a belief that humans are motivated only by self-interest, or more generally, that human beings are of little worth. So, First, we see there is a doxastic component to cynicism, that is, a belief-based component. But there's also an attitudinal component. The cynic must both have a dim view of human motivation and action, and then also conclude that that is a reason to be vaguely disgusted by humanity or treated as not worth very much at all. We've already seen the connection between the relevant beliefs and attitudes in our analysis of all relationships are transactional. The belief that romance is motivated by this narrow egoism, and thus that all relationships are a tug of war consisting of mutual exploitation, then encourages the believer to adopt an attitude themselves of cold exploitation towards their lovers, and generally a sort of an attitude of disgust towards romance, let's say. Weiss's paper also touches on quite a curious aspect of cynicism in this modern sense. Cynicism isn't really seen as a positive thing if you ask people directly. Sometimes it's outright condemned, and I'm partly doing that here. But at the same time, cynicism has a kind of allure to it that even I feel, and I think is basically undeniable. There's something kind of thrilling about being cynical. It's like you're grasping the dark heart of the universe, if that makes sense. It's the same unsettling excitement that we get when we learn about some of the really quite awful things that humanity has done to other aspects of humanity in the past. We get to think to ourselves, look at all these people who are blissfully unaware of the depravity of which humanity is capable, and yet I see the truth. In this case, it could even be a positive, since humanity is undeniably capable of awful things, and it's worth being aware of that, lest we blindly begin to repeat them. And I think that cynicism sort of trades on the same thrill of discovering some dark and forbidden truth about humankind. Weiss also points out that there are some genuine virtues of cynicism in certain situations. This even holds for statements like all relationships are transactional, and even on its narrowest definition. There is one major benefit of such an attitude. It will stop you getting taken for a fool if you do actually end up with someone who does view relationships as transactional. Cynicism is often incredibly well tuned to point out where supposedly virtuous people are using a shield of outer virtue to hide inner vice. At its best, it can be a kind of ethical bullshit detector. For instance, the channel Galatea and Asis has a video going through a number of examples of so-called nice guys, people who make a big show of appreciating women or their wives, who then turn out to be nasty or unfaithful. A hardline cynic would not have ended up with such people because they would have been hyper-skeptical from the start. Additionally, Samantha Weiss says that a characteristic property of the cynic is disengagement, and disengagement is sometimes a positive philosophical value. We want to be able to sit back and carefully choose the aspects of the world that we wish to engage with and which we wish to let pass us by. Cynicism, of course, takes this to its absolute extreme by recommending a total disengagement from the world, or in particular domains, or only engaging with the world in an emotionally detached sense, where we're really just trying to maximize our narrow self-interest, and thus we're sort of engaging with the world in a disengaged, ironic, self-interested premise. However, all of this disengagement does come at a real cost. Weiss argues, and I would agree, that in taking this detached, skeptical attitude, the cynic will ultimately deprive themselves of deep human relationships. It makes forging a connection with any person, or making any sacrifice for them, or wishing their good for their own sake, a deeply irrational move. They wouldn't do the same for you, so why are you even bothering? In British terms, it makes any behaviour based on hope or faith or charity a mug's game. But, of course, these are the very behaviours that do allow us to forge deep connections with others and create long-lasting relationships. Having said all that, I do think that Weiss's analysis leaves out what I think is one of the primary pleasures of the cynic, and that is a felt sense of superiority towards others. Since the cynic is disengaged from the world and from relationships where other people are emotionally engaged and vulnerable, it allows them to sort of stand above the rest of us and laugh when our hope or faith in other people does inevitably go awry in some cases, because although not all people are untrustworthy and narrowly egotistical, some undeniably are, and we will make mistakes. That is, the cynic gets to indulge in the biting joy of thinking, "I told you so," at relatively regular intervals. In epistemology, it's often said that there are two things that we want out of any belief system: to minimize false beliefs and to maximize true ones. We might make a similar remark about our dealings with other people. We want to minimize unwise interactions and maximize wise ones. Cynicism is the interpersonal equivalent of blanket skepticism, the unwillingness to believe in anything. But just as blanket skepticism only minimizes false beliefs and does not maximize true ones, cynicism only minimizes unwise interactions without maximizing wise or fulfilling ones. Thus, while it will never make you look like an idiot in quite the same way as being a credulous fool will, it doesn't come with the requisite benefits of genuine, experienced, practical wisdom. However, the lack of obvious blunders also gives cynicism the appearance of considered intelligence. Cynicism and intelligence have even become quite closely culturally intertwined, with the figure of the cynical wise guy who sees the world as it is cemented in popular culture. All of this, I think, makes cynicism a superficially helpful but ultimately disastrous approach to life. Outside of a few extreme situations where it might be empirically appropriate, it is self-isolation by 1,000 cuts. But beyond these personal harms, I want to think a little bit about what a cynical attitude does to the makeup of a society, and particularly with the trust of a society. I was reading some John Ruskin a while ago, and I was struck by this particular passage, so much so that I wrote it down in my notebook. "We have lost faith in common honesty and in the working power of it. And this faith, with the facts on which it may rest, it is quite our first business to recover and keep, not only believing, but even by experience assuring ourselves that there are yet in the world men who can be restrained from fraud otherwise than by the fear of losing employment. Nay, that it is even accurately in proportion to the number of such men in any state that the said state does or can prolong its existence." I think there is some real insight here. The extent to which we can reasonably trust one another is the extent to which we can relax in a community or a society. And, as we've already seen, the more people who promote the notion that everyone else is already a cynic, the more rational it becomes to actually adopt a cynical attitude. Again, I don't want to make any kind of grand claims about the downfall of civilization or anything like that, because I think they are overdramatic and hysterical, and they assume that cynicism is a new problem. It's not. That John Ruskin paragraph was written in the 19th century, and it already talks about the breakdown of trust within communities, or is at the very least worried about that. However, I do think that the more cynical we become in a given area, the more difficult it will be to build trust there. And considering just how important trust is to allowing a community to function, this is a pretty dangerous road to go down. Again, I don't want to catastrophize, but I do want to point out that this is a problem. However, there is a further complication and a further benefit to being a cynic that I would be remiss not to mention. It's something that I find quite difficult to acknowledge given my wider anti-cynical stance. It's that if you are in a community of relatively trusting people, it's often personally beneficial, at least in the short term, to be a cynic, even though that damages the social fabric as a whole. This is the position that David Mazzella, following Alex Keenan, calls the master cynic, the person who truly is just out for themselves and uses that to take advantage of the people around them who have more pro-social attitudes. I'll give you an example to illustrate this, because otherwise it can get quite abstract. Imagine that you were dropped on an island where there was total perfect trust. If you said something to someone, they would just believe you, and it wouldn't cross anyone's mind that you were lying. Well, if you did happen to be a cynical, self-interested agent, you could get quite a lot out of this situation. You could sell counterfeit goods at ridiculous prices. You could make elaborate promises to the most beautiful person on the island that you would make their lives wonderful, and they will believe you and want to be with you. You could basically become ruler of this island of perfectly trusting people overnight. Of course, in practice, what you'd probably do is manage to make a fair bit of money and get ahead in the society of that island, while at the same time destroying the underlying ethos of trust at work and ensuring that everybody ultimately loses. And I think that this is why I've been so critical of people who peddle cynical ideas that everyone is selfish or that all relationships are narrowly transactional. I don't think these are harmless ideas. I think they both harm the people that believe them and erode the limited trust that exists between us. That trust is a fragile thing. Once it's gone, it's quite difficult to get back. And the peddler of cynicism trades in pieces of this precious social trust for pure self-benefit. Their cynical proclamations apply most aptly to themselves. But things are a bit more complex than they first appear. I've been quite harsh on cynicism, but I also think that it would be far too hasty to reject it in its entirety. And to understand why, I think we need to take a look at the history of this strange term and rediscover some of its noble origins. 4. Cynicism within limits. What's the difference between Diogenes and your average modern cynic? Well, according to David Mazzella in his book The Making of Modern Cynicism, one major difference, though it's not the only one, is that Diogenes' displays weren't simply negative. He was arguing for a particular ethical framework. When Diogenes criticized the social mores of Athens for being arbitrary and for taking us away from nature, and thus when he himself lived on the streets like a dog, he became a living embodiment and argument for abandoning those social mores. He showed that a person could live without them, and in his apparent joy and virility, he recommended this way of life to the people that surrounded him. When he told Alexander the Great to stop blocking his sunlight, he was practically demonstrating that his philosophy meant that even the most powerful person on the planet at the time couldn't push him around. And he did make genuine critiques of the way that ancient Athenians placed too much value on things like wealth and civic social status, critiques that we would probably agree with today. But these critiques ultimately stemmed from his own positive philosophy. He did want to improve the people that he spoke to, not simply degrade them, although you might argue that he went about that in a funny sort of way. A purely destructive cynic, however, doesn't stand on their own positive philosophy. They simply want to tear down everyone else's ideas about the world. When they present a vision of mankind as narrowly egoistic and say that they cannot amount to anything more, they don't say this to spur us to become better. It comes from a place of pure critique. But as much as I've railed against this kind of cynicism in this video, I do think that such a critique is sometimes important. Mazzella points this out himself in the realm of politics. The person who is totally disenchanted and cynical concerning politics may have actually seen things that are wrong with the political sphere that more hopeful people haven't yet picked up on. I think that observation probably is more apt in the realm of politics than it is in the realm of love. But there are more measured versions of the cynical ideas that we've looked at that can be genuinely useful. However, they're only useful if, alongside the destruction of an old idea, they involve the construction of a new one. Similar to the way Diogenes would critique the social system of Athens while offering up his own ethical framework in its place. Let's revisit the phrase, all relationships are transactional. There was a variant of this that was true. Relationships are transactional, provided that we take the word transactional in the broad sense that both sides are far more likely to stay and be happy if they believe that they are getting something from the relationship in the long term. This doesn't mean the entire dynamic is tit for tat, but in this more moderate form, what I've called the trivial form, it does encourage us to not take our lovers for granted. This is a good message, and it does rely on us recognizing that human beings aren't angels or Disney characters. We do also have self-interested motives as well as other interested ones. There is nothing wrong with acknowledging this, and if it does encourage us to not take our partners for granted, then it may even enhance our interpersonal bonds. It might make us reflect on what we are doing to contribute to our partners' lives. In this more modest form, this idea is directly opposed to being extractive towards your partner. It in fact advises you to find someone who takes natural joy in the same things that you do, such that you can both make one another happy without extraordinary amounts of effort against your natural inclinations. If you enjoy giving physical affection, then it encourages you to find someone who enjoys receiving it, and so on and so forth. At the same time, it does make us put aside that Disney film mode of love that many of us have grown up with in stories, where love itself, abstracted from any kind of action or behavior, is always strong enough to survive anything, and relationships should always be easy. A little touch of cynicism can be a good thing. Here are the kinds of useful questions that this broad transactionality thesis might raise. What do I want my partner to value and take pleasure in about me? What are the kind of things I want to bring to a partner's life and why? How do I make sure that I find someone who takes positive pleasure from the things I find easier to give? Through this framework, all sorts of interesting and valuable lines of thinking can start. You might not want someone who places too much value on your looks or your money, since those things are contingent, and in the case of looks, they will definitely fade over time. You might instead place a high priority on finding someone who values aspects of your personality, because those aspects can be longer lasting, and at the very least, you would almost always be able to provide that, and thus provide something that brings them pleasure. You might reflect upon what duties you think you and your partner have towards one another to ensure that you both keep getting something out of the relationship. These, in my opinion, are fantastic questions and thoughts to have, and they can be prompted by this kind of moderate cynicism. This would involve, however, the construction of this new ideal for the relationship, one that takes into account the elements of the cynical critique that are true and asks where we can go from there. Or take the phrase, everyone is selfish. If we dial this down to just acknowledging that people do have their own self-interested desires and that we should take that into account when we interact with them, that's both true and potentially very, very good advice. We shouldn't walk around the world thinking that everyone always wants what's best for us, regardless of the cost to themselves. That's absolutely ridiculous. Moreover, not acknowledging what is in other people's interests could lead to us being overly selfish or thoughtless ourselves. It is generally good practice to take other people's desires and wishes into account when we're making our own decisions. So, again, the simple observation, when it's devoid of contempt or scorn and doesn't give up hope for humanity, can actually be rather helpful. However, and I think this is really important to note, it's not just as simple as saying that there is a definite middle point between cynicism and naivety that we all need to find and then we'll be happy forever. I think the concept that we're lacking here is a developed notion of phronesis, or practical wisdom. This is an idea from Aristotle which essentially defines how we ought to apply different virtues and characteristics in different situations. To give a trivial example, it is knowing that a battlefield requires more courage than an important work meeting, and so on and so forth. Something Aristotle is quick to emphasize in the Nicomachean Ethics is that phronesis isn't the kind of thing that you can teach people from first principles and then just let them run with it. It's something that we gradually learn by engaging with the world until eventually it is automatic and instinctive. In epistemic jargon, phronesis is a kind of procedural knowledge. A classic example of procedural knowledge, and incidentally of tacit procedural knowledge, is riding a bike. This comes from the 20th century philosopher Michael Polanyi. When you ride a bike, you're not just drawing on explicit propositional knowledge about where it's appropriate to ride that bike and so on. You are drawing on tacit know-how about how to stay balanced on the bike and how to steer it just right to rebalance if you wobble and how to coordinate your pedals with your handlebars and so on. If I were to ask you exactly how you know all of those things, you probably wouldn't be able to tell me, and you certainly couldn't teach it to me propositionally. But you can perform them all the same. It's something that you have to learn from experience. And I suspect that the process of navigating trust in interpersonal relationships involves phronesis or something slightly analogous to it. It involves taking everything you've experienced about a person and all your past experiences, and then using that to make a semi-conscious but also quite instinctive judgment about their relative trustworthiness and the extent to which they merit a cynical approach, and thus which virtues and characteristics are relevant to bring to the table in that interaction. But this is a trial and error process. It's not something you can teach someone merely propositionally. It involves getting stuck into real-world social situations, trusting some people, and seeing how it goes. I don't think it's a coincidence that much of the cynical content regarding romantic relationships is specifically targeted towards very young people, and especially teenagers. These are people that don't necessarily have that much experience with in-person romantic relationships, and so they don't necessarily have the kind of practical wisdom that will allow them to confidently judge who is worthy of trust and who is worthy of wariness. At the same time, they probably know that love is important, and they're probably aware that they can get quite badly hurt if they fall for the wrong person. So there is a real incentive to figure out some principle by which they can ensure that they don't go wrong. So essentially, you have a population of inexperienced, scared people who simply don't want to get hurt. This is the perfect market for an extreme destructive cynicism, because the one thing that it can genuinely promise is that you are less likely to get hurt if you follow it. You just have to read the small print to figure out that it will deprive you of an awful lot of joy as well. Effectively, I think that this destructive blanket cynicism can function as a way to avoid the messy business of acquiring practical wisdom in the realm of interpersonal relationships. It takes all the bewildering complexity of figuring out how other people work, developing our ability to understand them, developing our own interpersonal virtues, finding out who has our best interests at heart and who's taking us for a ride, and then managing those virtues and characteristics in those specific situations, and attempts to boil it down into one or two principles that are just meant to keep you safe from harm. It's the every gun is loaded theory of other people. Except we lose basically nothing from assuming that every gun is loaded, and we lose an awful lot by treating everyone as loaded guns. It's a poor substitute for real experience, but it's still a substitute, which is why it can be sold so effectively to the inexperienced. And of course, approaching your life in a cynical way does make it more likely that others will come to view you as self-interested and respond in kind to you, because now they're defending against your cynical outlook. That is, the more cynical you are, the more people will learn to be cynical towards you. So eventually it will just seem like you were right all along because your behavior has closed off all alternative paths. And I think that's what I find most pernicious about cynicism. It traps the cynic in a self-perpetuating cycle where their own cynicism becomes forever reinforced by the way that people respond to that cynicism. This doesn't just occur at the societal level, but it also just occurs at the straightforward personal one. It's a shame, then, that this message is being shown to the very young and the very inexperienced about love every day, millions of times. I would say that they're only making themselves miserable, but the truth is they'll take many other people down with them. However, to draw again on Mazzella's work, I don't think we should spend too much time critiquing just your average person who comes to a cynical view on love or on their relationships with other people. Ultimately, they aren't the master cynic. They're not the person seeking and achieving their own self-advancement directly at the cost of other people. That role belongs to the people actively pushing and profiting from this message, as well as those who take that message as an excuse to treat the loved ones in their own life very poorly. The problem isn't necessarily that people are sometimes discontented about the state of love or relationships. These areas of life just are difficult and vulnerable in some ways that are unavoidable, and some ways where I think we could listen to certain cynical proclamations in order to disabuse us of notions that are far too idealistic, like the Disney picture of romance we touched upon earlier. Instead, it's the people who make this hopeless, cynical attitude justified, either by spreading their cynicism with spurious arguments or by demonstrating it in their own exploitative approach to the people in their lives, who are causing the real damage here. I largely don't want to point and laugh at the person who's bought snake oil. I want to prevent the snake oil salesman from rolling into town again. Now, I don't really have a neat thesis to give you at the end here, because my overall point is that knowing when cynicism is appropriate is not the kind of thing that we can flawlessly theorize about in advance. It takes on-the-ground knowledge to learn how to navigate this. However, I wanted to emphasize the strengths of the cynic in this last section as well as their weaknesses, because I do think there is a place for cynical critique. I just think it must be paired with a similar will towards constructing new ideas and goals and ideals to take the place of the old ones that the cynic has attempted to dispense with. Cynicism can be absolutely fantastic, so long as cynicism isn't the end point of our inquiry. But so often it is far easier to critique existing ideas than to build new ones from the ground floor up, knowing that these ideas will be imperfect and will require further work and refining. But at the very least, if you are going to be a total cynic, don't be one because of any of the arguments we've looked at today, because they absolutely do not work. And if you want to know what I think is behind some of the modern day complaints about love, I have a full video on just that right here. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.